Good morning and welcome to this webinar on managing cyber risks. The theme is simple. The task is not. The theme is we can't eliminate cyber risk exposures, but we certainly as risk managers can do a better job in managing the consequences. Sorry, the screen is frozen for some reason. Ironic, isn't it? Just give me a sec. We'll start over again because the screen, for some reason, takes a bit of time to get in the mode that we have to have it. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Actually, Josh, I'm still confused about that 15 seconds. You mean 15 seconds from the time you say?
It should be.
There is some timing within the voice if you're hearing.
It should be fine. You should. We're fine as of now. If you want to go,
Well,
it's been.
Wait a minute. No, we want to start over again, right? So.
Yeah, I can edit it. I can just cut it out with the video editor.
All right.
So.
Got it.
Okay.
Jeez. Maybe an audience is necessary to make these things work. Okay, let's hit it again. We'll start from the top.
Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and action.
Good day, and welcome to this webinar on managing cyber risks. The theme is simple, but the task is not. The theme is we can't eliminate cyber risk exposure, but we can, as risk managers, do a better job to manage the consequences. I am Rick Denning, President, Shelter Island Risk Services, and this is the first program in our 2012 webinar series. While Shelter Island's core services are analytics and helping clients select and improve risk management information systems, this topic is far broader and deals with, in essence, business planning needed to survive a cyber attack. We are very fortunate to have two speakers with the experience and practical current knowledge to contribute to this subject. And these are Neeraj, Sahni, who is Insurance Channel Client Executive at Kroll in Manhattan, and Lori Nugent, Co-Chair Data Security and Cyber Liability at Wilson, Eisner, Moskowitz, Edelman, and Dicker in Chicago. I think the best way to introduce these speakers is to give them a chance to do it themselves. So Neeraj, if you'd like to comment on your role, and then Lori, take it from there. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Rick. Yeah, this is Neeraj Sahni, and I'm with Kroll. And my main focus is to help insureds who have cyber insurance with both their breach response as well as proactive incident response prior to the breach. So prior to coming to Kroll, I was actually underwriting with Chartis AIG, and that's where I had some exposure on different types of cyber risks and different types of policies that are written in the space. So look forward to the presentation.
Thank you. And Lori?
Thanks, Rick. We appreciate the opportunity to talk with this group, and just wanted to, by way of background, I head our firm's national data security and cyber liability practice. We have over 20 partners all across the country who do work in this space. We handle everything from helping companies evaluate their existing systems to improve and to document that they're working hard to do what they can to avoid exposing sensitive data, to handling breach response and litigation and regulatory activity stemming from use or misuse of computerized information.
Oh, excellent. Let me frame the focus of this program and how we are approaching it. We'll discuss the exposures that cyber risk represents to organizations. We'll talk about the environment operationally and even legally that are involved. Finally, the consequences of a breach, and perhaps most important, some planning procedures to help organizations better deal with these matters. And of course, we'll have questions and answers at the end of the presentation. The exposure is obvious. Over the career that I've had, information has expanded dramatically. And in fact, some information, as you will know, is more equal than others and represents potentially very sensitive information should it be disclosed to improper parties. I think one of the points that we discussed here was as beneficial as information can be, it also represents a potential liability. And some companies perhaps keep far more information than is really actionable and valuable, but that old information can turn out to be a serious problem should it be disclosed. Among our panelists, I'd like to start with Neeraj to discuss this issue about the companies and the nature of the information they do maintain.
Sure, thanks, Rick. Just like to comment on that. I feel like in this world of electronic information, most companies with any number of employees would have some type of sensitive data that would be accessible within the company. So making that data accessible anywhere makes security a bigger challenge. And so just having a firewall these days in a company does not make it a secure environment because that's only at the perimeter level. So they tend to dig deeper now to find what the data is, what the classification is, and without any type of layered security, these companies don't really have enough security to consolidate their data in one place. The other areas of enterprise that we have seen lately is definitely the mobile devices, or allowing employees to connect via USB, the iPods or other peripheral devices. So those are data devices that could have information on them, and if they are compromised, that's a risk to that company.
And Neeraj, I'm sure you would agree, and I'd like Lori to comment that the picture is further complicated by the fact that many companies share data outside of their own and perhaps add to their exposure. Lori, how do you view that issue?
I think, frankly, as part of looking at cybersecurity from an enterprise standpoint, one of the most important things companies can do is become aware of the security that's in place for their business partners. And by business partners, we mean anybody who has access to your sensitive data. That can be as low down the totem pole as the cleaners that service the office. We've seen a number of breaches that have happened because cleaning staff were literally recruited by some of the large criminal organizations that are collecting and selling sensitive data, all the way up to companies that you might work with either in a joint venture capacity or just in the normal course of business with whom you routinely share information back and forth, either as part of working together or as part of billing and collecting procedures. You're only as safe as your weakest link.
Yes, we should all learn that. The environment that this operates, it would be inconceivable for an organization today not to be aware of the threat. In fact, the amount of information is perhaps part of the problem because it is so overwhelming. On that basis, then, Lori, what are some of the efforts that need to be done to prepare for a breach?
I think an important step, and arguably the first step, needs to be to identify the team of people that will be involved when a breach happens. I can't tell you the number of times we've been handling a breach and the first call to the client involves a discussion of who needs to be involved because they haven't thought through what will be their process in responding to breach. Many companies have crisis management teams. This is a great place to start in terms of putting your team together. But when you deal with a breach, you'll obviously need somebody from IT. You definitely need the risk manager. You probably need somebody from the public relations team. And you need to have a plan for communicating with management, and depending on the company, you may need to have a plan for communicating outside and possibly also with the board of directors. These are not decisions that you should be taking on the fly in the midst of the crisis of responding to a breach. It's much better to have considered this in advance and have a plan in place so that you can just roll the plan out when the breach happens.
Neeraj, from your viewpoint, tell me a little bit more about some of the causes of breaches and perhaps some of the differences between perceptions and reality as you see it in Kroll.
Sure. I mean, historically, I feel like breaches, I agree with Lori, like breach response is the most important thing, but historically there wasn't enough money to have a plan in place for the breaches. So the changes in regulations have allowed companies to have some type of incident response plan for just compliance purposes, but that doesn't mean that they would have a plan that will be workable when a breach does happen. So preparing for the breach is one of the most important steps, I feel, for loss control purposes in any organization that has sensitive data. So if they wait for the breach to create the plan, that's a very reactive way to act. So that can definitely cause more liability to any company. So an effective incident response plan would really mean to test that plan regularly, and they would know what the scale of the breach would be when it does happen. So those are my thoughts on that.
You had mentioned before, Neeraj, that people conceive of hacking as kind of the ultimate, but is that not always the case?
No, most of the breaches that we see at Kroll, I would say maybe up to 50% are not really any external hacking. We see a lot of employee error, employee failure type of issues that cause a breach, just losing a laptop, or a phishing attack or social engineering. So it doesn't have to be an employee who intentionally did something wrong, but it could just be that they were tricked into doing something where they lost the data. So the focus is on reducing the likelihood of that employee doing those wrong things. And that's why companies do focus on like internal employee awareness training now. They spend dollars on that because they see some return on investment in doing that rather than just securing their networks.
It's perhaps a footnote, but I heard a presentation, I think Neeraj was involved, that there's no such thing as a lost laptop. They've always been stolen. Human error, which leads to the next slide. Lori, Neeraj, what are some of the human error issues that are involved in this environment? I'll start with Neeraj.
Sure. No, just echo the point I made before. Human error is really the employees or maybe the third parties that are working on behalf of the company, and so that can most likely be the cause of the breach in some kind of way where it's not always just technical. It's a combination of technical and human, or only human error. So that's definitely one of the big factors that can lead to a data breach.
And Laura, you'd mentioned before the second point here about data that's outside of the organization. Perhaps you'd comment a little bit more about the nature of outsourcing, et cetera, and its implications of liability.
Sure. I think one of the most important things that risk managers can do when opening dialogue about managing cyber exposure risks, cybersecurity, is to be aware that the majority of breaches are not network hacks, and that many of the breaches aren't even things that happen within your own company. They're things that happen with people that you work with, companies that you work with. So the dialogue from an enterprise standpoint is about how do we manage human error, how do we manage our relationships with our business partners and with others who have access to our data, and what can we working as a team do to make certain that our bottom line and our reputation is protected when a breach happens. So I think those are important points to talk about as a management team. In terms of how your data gets exposed, we've identified outsourcing, billing and collection, and information sharing. Those are three common routes that we see breaches happening involving multi-parties. When I first started doing breach response work years and years ago, most breaches were lost laptops or other things that involved just the one company. The reality today is that companies are interconnected in the way that they do business every day. So when we see a breach happening today, it is highly unusual to have just one entity involved in the breach. So it's important to be aware of the outsourcing relationships and the other relationships, and where practicable, to address by contract who is going to have what kind of responsibility when there's a breach. Will you be informed about it? Will you have the opportunity to be engaged in the process? Who will indemnify whom? All of those things need to be addressed.
Excellent. I think to our last point, we envision risk managers as being an integral part of this overall plan, but equally, risk managers are directly involved because most, if not all, are using outside sources such as TPAs, RMIS vendors, et cetera, brokers and insurers, who have data that is very sensitive because of the medical information elsewhere. So risk managers really need to also adapt exactly what, Lori, what you were saying, as the framework to deal with their own expansion of the data. Recently, again, outside of cyber risk, I think cloud computing is probably getting almost as much press. Neeraj, would you comment on cloud computing and what it does to the issues that we're discussing here on cyber risk?
Sure. I mean, I think cloud is becoming a part of the cyber risk just with the outsource, and it's kind of an aggregation issue for some of the carriers. But it is definitely a new buzzword for most businesses because you know, they can do something with the cloud in a more inexpensive manner. But it started with like two different outsource scenarios. First was just software as a service, where you could use a service on the cloud without having to install applications internally, to a more common infrastructure as a service now, where the whole data centers can be managed service cloud. So it's attractive for its obvious cost savings, its economies of scale, but then it presents various risks where if PII or PHI is on the cloud providers are not really guaranteeing that information to be secure. So that's a risk of that company putting that data on the cloud. So cheaper providers like Amazon have shared hosting services where they would have like a virtual space, which could be anywhere in the world, and that could pose regulatory issues of non-compliance with EU or other privacy issues. And the issue we see from Kroll's perspective on you know, doing something for forensic purposes, it's a virtual space, and if you have to investigate where or what timeline was for the breach to happen, we can't really do that on virtual space. We need to image the drive from a real server to be able to do that. So whenever it's a virtual environment, we cannot really get the forensic evidence we need to do the investigation. If it's a dedicated cloud, a private cloud, then it is possible to be able to capture that. So those are some of my thoughts on the cloud.
Yeah, very good. Well, these are some points that I think anyone has to take into account as they move in that direction. Lori, from a legal viewpoint, what jurisdictions' laws typically apply when there is a breach?
That's a great point. I can't tell you how many companies are astounded when a breach happens to learn that even if their operations are entirely within one state, the laws of other jurisdictions may apply in terms of breach notification obligations. Breach notification laws are based upon the location of the residence of the breached individual. So if, for example, you're a hospital and you have a tourist from a different state that receives services in your hospital and you have a breach of that person's data, the law that applies to determine the notification obligation is most likely going to be the resident of that the resident state of that tourist. So it's very important to be aware of the complicated interaction between the laws of jurisdictions, and furthermore, the complications that result when we have people who are resident of countries other than the United States that are involved in a breach that happens in the United States, because there may be interlocking obligations that may not be consistent, both between states and between countries. Also, I want to raise at this point the importance of cloud in terms of jurisdiction and security. from a legal standpoint, when we do e-discovery, when we respond to breaches, as Neeraj said, we have to image the servers. If your cloud solution involves a shared server, we have seen situations where it's been necessary to obtain court assistance to access the server because the server is the point at which the breach must be traced. And if the server is shared, you may not have rights to access that additional information. So it's very important to understand physically where is the server, and beyond that, is it all yours? So that if we have a breach, your counsel can go out there and get an image, have an image obtained of a server in a particular location without obtaining additional authority from other entities that may store data on the server. So it's very important to know where the data resides. And just to comment on Neeraj's discussion of shared hosting services, from a lawyer's perspective, in terms of helping companies respond to breach, communicating with regulators, as well as litigating, the concept that you have a shared hosting service where you don't even know where the data resides is absolutely terrifying. It's very difficult to explain to a jury or to a court why it would ever be okay to have sensitive data in that kind of a construct. So be very careful when you deal with cloud, because there are so many different flavors. It's important to understand exactly what you're buying.
Good points, of course. And on the same slide, perhaps just to reiterate some of the points that were already mentioned, in planning, there is certain obligatory issues, and I think, Laura, you've listed them here in terms of the response team, et cetera. Can you add anything to that series of points?
Sure. I think it's very important when you're responding to a breach that you not be doing it for the first time. Most of the time when there's a breach of any scale, the company's reputation is on the line. That's not the time to be trying to figure out who needs to be involved and who has the authority to make decisions and what are you going to say and who's going to be the spokesperson. It's very important that the company have a plan and be able to roll it out in a calm and reasoned way.
Neeraj, you agree that learning on the job is a bad idea, I take it?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's a whole process. Like over at Kroll, we have got it down to a science where once a breach happens, there's some investigative process to assess the damage and then kind of find out as to what the affected population is, due to the breach. So if it's all done internally, sometimes forensically we've seen instances where we don't have the evidence that we needed to determine that population because the internal IT folks might have already touched that data that wasn't supposed to be. So there's a challenge, and we have to sometimes redo the work to figure out exactly what really happened at the time of the breach.
Well, and Neeraj, that's a really great point. One challenge that we see is oftentimes companies want to keep everything internal. We have seen situations where that was the initial feeling, and unfortunately later it turned out that the breach was in part caused by somebody fairly high in the IT structure of the company who had been recruited by outside criminal forces that were working very aggressively to gain access to the information. So it's important that you be able to show that somebody independent did the investigation, because you can bet that a regulator or a plaintiff's counsel will try very hard to cast aspersions on the internal IT team if there is any basis for questioning.
Good point, and which raises moving into the consequences of when data are exposed, and I think both Lori and Neeraj have emphasized the issue is really not if, it's when, because that's the nature of the world today. Neeraj, from your background, what are some of the ways that we can measure the impact of a data breach?
Definitely. There's been a lot of research done on different companies have done papers on, like Verizon and Ponemon, in terms of cost of breaches and the volume, how it's going up. Especially in the last year, it was really the middle market that had most of the breaches. Ponemon thinks the cost of a breach is about $214 per record, and they focus on the healthcare breaches as being on the rise. So that's the public data that's out there. I can quote some of the public breaches examples where the damages were real and in millions. One of the ones that was most common of the rogue employee was Countrywide, where a rogue employee sold mortgage applicant data to hackers, which eventually led to class action suits for $20 million for invasion of privacy and punitive damages. So that created a lot of awareness in the space. And this was after Bank of America got Countrywide. The other one, which was technically savvy, was RBS WorldPay, where hackers were able to do a SQL injection on the database of the public-facing website and attain credit card data, which I internally used to draw money from ATMs to a value of about $9 million. So that was like real damages where those Visa ATM companies sued RBS for third-party damages. And lastly was the hurtling payment systems, which had the largest breach in terms of size, about 130 million credit card records. They were in total compliance with PCI when it happened, but there were still fines and penalties from both Visa and MasterCard because point where the breach happened, that area was not fully compliant. So that's one of the gaps I feel in PCI, where they could do a full assessment for a portion of the network, but not still say that it's fully certified.
Lori, moving on to the consequences more perhaps from a legal perspective, perhaps you could comment on some of the ways that potential exposure arises even when people themselves are doing a good job.
Sure. I think one of the issues to look at, and an area that risk managers can really keep an eye out, is on mergers and acquisitions. Due diligence on a merger is a pretty commonly handled thing, and people have a good sense of what to do there. But oftentimes we see companies that don't really think through in the merger context what happens to the data when the company is acquired. We've seen large breaches where very sophisticated companies are in transition, and the acquired company won't immediately be on the IT backbone of the company that's just purchased the acquired company. So what you'll find is there's a period of transition that can be anywhere from 6 months to 18 months or more that will happen, where the data that resides in the acquired company's systems is being transitioned to the new IT backbone. We do see breaches that happen in that time period, in that window, and it's very important from a risk management perspective to be aware of the enhanced exposure that may exist for the company that's the acquirer, and to make sure that you have good insurance solutions in place to protect the new information that has come on board that is not as secure as your main systems. Also, there is a lot of regulatory activity in this space. There are a number of statutes that come into play. Most notably for publicly traded companies, the SEC has recently issued guidance that requires information to be included on financial statements about cybersecurity and about breaches. So it's important to be aware of these things as acquisitions happen, and also as management addresses cyber from an enterprise risk standpoint. And again, testing is so important. Being able to talk about what the plan is and being able to test the plan makes such a difference when we're dealing with regulators post-breach and when we're dealing with plaintiff's counsel, because we have clear documents and clear proof that the company wasn't clueless and careless about cybersecurity. Instead, they were trying very hard to do appropriate things. Nobody is going to have a completely bulletproof system. Nobody's going to be able to 100% keep data secure, but it's very important to minimizing regulatory consequences and to minimize litigation exposure, to be able to show that the company has affirmatively done things.
Neeraj, on that basis, do you also see that kind of beneficial impact by rigorously testing these programs?
Yeah, definitely. To Lori's point, I agree. Historically it was seen as the IT department's role to ensure that the breach response testing done, but it's more a business need. It's a risk manager's responsibility to ensure there's business buy-in to have a proper breach response plan in place. So IT may have an incident response plan, but if it's never tested, it's a total ineffective tool, and the assigned parties who are within the company and dedicated on the plan, they may not even be aware as to what their role and responsibility is. So another way how companies could address that risk is also having a partner who can assist them with the incident response breach lifecycle if a breach happens, because all companies don't have all the individuals that they need to be able to react when a breach does happen. So one way is doing a penetration test ahead of time and finding what those gaps may be to avoid the breach. And once they find the gaps, they know that if the breach does happen, these are things they would need to address. So it's all about practicing an incident, doing the response testing, and then that makes the company more efficient if a breach does happen, and just handling it and doing those mock scenarios.
Very good. Interestingly enough, in starting preparation for this topic, I received some people's comments in the risk management community that this whole topic was really an IT topic. It was something that risk managers really didn't focus on, and I have been certainly learning just the opposite, that this is perhaps one of the biggest areas of opportunity. And as Lori mentions, when you think about cyber risk, I can't think of a company that doesn't have a dimension of cyber risk in its own plan for enterprise risk. So Lori, on this basis, what's your experience for best defining the roles of IT and risk managers?
Again, I think the dialogue needs to focus not just on network security and hacking, but on the human elements and on our business partners. And what IT and risk management can do together with legal and the individual operating units to identify the exposures and manage the exposures. The real reputation here is the brand. It's not just liability for a breach, it's the brand. When you open the Wall Street Journal and you see your company's name on the front page associated with a breach, and people are talking about, well, is the company managing the breach appropriately, and how in the heck did this happen in the first place? It's very useful to be able to say, A, the company is managing the breach very well. Here's what we're doing. Here's the plan that's been deployed. And B, it's very useful to be able to explain that the company has always taken reasonable steps to secure data. But it's very hard to do that on a reactive basis if the company is trying to figure out how to deal with its first breach while having its first breach. From a management standpoint, it doesn't have to take a lot of time, a lot of money, or a lot of resources to be very well prepared to respond to a breach. Most companies do have a crisis management team in place. The crisis management team most probably can be deployed to address a breach. You may need to add 1 or 2 people to it, but most companies are able to use their crisis management team effectively to address breach. We've helped a lot of companies tweak their crisis management plan to include cyber and breach response. But it's important that we have a plan for communication, we have an identified team, we have clear lines about who has authority to decide what. When you manage it well, we've had situations where the breach happened, the crisis management team was deployed, and we actually had articles in the press where experts that we didn't retain, that we didn't know about, were commenting on the action that happened and using it as an exemplar of what other companies should follow. When you have that kind of press following a breach, your reputation is actually enhanced. The opposite is true if you don't have a plan in place.
Oh, very good. Let's go on to the planning essentials here. And Neeraj, I'd like to get your thoughts about a topic that I think a lot of people are confused. We talked earlier about where the internal versus the external kind of crime, and here we're talking about the direction of cybercrime. What are your thoughts on that topic from your perspective and experience?
Sure. Cybercrime has come a long way. In the past, it was the bad guys were really the college student, the script kiddies who got a kick out of defacing a commercial website like Yahoo about 10 years ago, or a government site based on like the movies that we've seen. But now external hacking is it's more industrialized. The cybercriminal marketplace is where money can be made. There's different type of sensitive data that is auctioned like a eBay platform. So these sites, these chat sites, allow anonymous hackers and criminals to sell and buy credit card numbers, social security numbers, or even healthcare data for fake medical ID cards. So this is a real space, and there's some celebrities now in this space. People like Albert Gonzalez, who was featured in the Rolling Stone magazines after he was accused of some of the big breaches like TJ Maxx and hurtling. And the main issue here is not just getting a kick out of getting on a website. It's real money that these people have made, and I think over the next few years we'll see more sovereign type of exposure also. We heard of Stuxnet for the Iranian program, and there are other things that are happening on the cyber risk that is evolving to a different level.
Laurie, you've been a very, very strong advocate of planning. Here's some additional points. Do these all fit into your essential planning process?
Absolutely. Again, this slide is really intended to provide a few very simple bullet points of easy things that companies can do, probably with many things that are already in place, that can make them better prepared to respond to a breach. The communication plan. Who is going to be your point person to communicate outside? Who has authority to communicate within the company about steps that need to be taken and to keep the employees aware to the extent that they need to be aware? Who is on your breach response team and why? And what are their responsibilities? Is it your crisis management team? Do you need to add somebody to that? Or will that work and function? It's great if you have an agreed upon breach response action plan. It can be very simple. When there's a breach, one of these people needs to be called. Then there will be a call of the crisis management team for breach response. Then they'll call outside counsel or whatever role you decide to take in terms of how you're going to manage the actual exposure. But learning on the job is not the best way to proceed here. It's a good idea to have a plan in place, and from a risk manager standpoint, when there is a breach, if there's no plan in place, I've seen many risk managers having challenges dealing with the board and dealing with the CEO and sometimes the CFO to explain why this wasn't tested before. You don't want to be in that hot seat.
Laurie, we've spent the entire discussion up to this point on principles, risk management principles, if you will. But I want to ask a final question to the two of you regarding insurance and the role insurance plays, and how your view is toward that as being one of the factors in a success of dealing with this exposure.
Sure, this is Laurie. Insurance is an important part of the financial bottom line analysis of what happens to a company when there's a breach. There are many different kinds of policies available. You can get coverage from $1 in certain circumstances. You can have attachment points and retentions and sublimits and all sorts of other options. So you need to have a serious dialogue with your broker about what you need and what works. But it's very important to consider the cost of breach up front, because by definition, breach costs are not reserved, they're not planned, they're not part of anybody's budget. The cost of responding to breach and dealing with the PR storm that can happen, and communicating with regulators and dealing with regulatory fines and communicating with plaintiffs' lawyers and dealing with class actions can be very substantial. It can have a meaningful effect on cash flow. So it's important from a risk management standpoint, from an enterprise risk standpoint, to consider what are the likely cost consequences, where will the cash come from, are you going to set up a reserve, are you going to get insurance for this, how are you going to protect the bottom line when the breach happens. And remember, because of the SEC's guidance, if you're a publicly traded company, it may be necessary to provide public communications about the extent to which your financials could be materially impacted if there were a breach.
I'll just add to Lori's point. Insurance does give access. It's a transfer of risk, so it gives access to a company to a number of resources in a packaged manner, like vendors that they already have predefined pricing with in the event the breach happens, panel counsels, and just overall crisis management, which is necessary to circumvent that risk of the breach. So I think it's coverage that's expanding a lot, especially in the U.S., and it's only on the growth, so it has to expand further based on the number of breaches we are seeing out there.
And just a follow-on comment on that. The statistics are showing that less than 20% of companies have purchased cyber insurance. From a risk management standpoint, that's very difficult to understand because the insurance is very inexpensive. I view the uptake of insurance in this space as a barometer for the number and the portion of boards of directors and senior management that have meaningfully evaluated their cyber exposure and determined whether they're going to keep it on their balance sheet or use insurance as a vehicle to shift some of it off their balance sheet. So it's really important at this stage, with the SEC's enhanced focus, with other regulatory agencies that have staffed up and have trained their staff to go out and regulate. They're going to be investigating. They're going to be fining. It's very important to focus on this from a cash flow standpoint.
Well, excellent, and excellent to both of you for such an introduction of a very intricate but very important subject. If you're seeing this program by being replayed from our website, that doesn't mean you can't address questions to Shelter Island. Our information is clearly on the website. And both Lori and Neeraj have provided a telephone number on the very first or second slide of this program. So that's another option there should you decide to pursue some specific questions with them. I'd also like to emphasize, hopefully this is something of interest to you, because we're using these webinars to more broadly educate our audiences on interesting topics. And the next, after we resolve the difficulties of cyber risk, we'd like to point out some of the pitfalls and hopefully some of the solutions of RMIS implementations. And that's going to be coming up the 13th of March at our regular time, 11 on Tuesdays, the second Tuesday of each month. Look forward to your participation. And again, a special thanks to Neeraj and Lori for a very lucid presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Take care.
Thank you much.
Take care now.